Did you have any particular place you wanted to start before we got into the agenda you posted?
No,
Okay.
no.
All right. Uh, You've got a lot of good issues here. I thought that this would be the better, easier way to address them because some of them could be lengthy.
Okay.
Your first one, you're talking about different types of change.
Right.
Give me a little bit more about that because there's a number of different ways to classify and change.
Okay. Really what I've been noticing, and this all comes from just observations of kind of what people have been talking about, both on the Futocracy network and then on LinkedIn and then in different articles that I've been seeing about change management. So the types of change, so I've been thinking about, what changes occur in the organization. And we talk about the traditional top-down kind of large-scale changes that often involve the layoffs and restructurings. That I think primarily what we're talking about of why change doesn't work. Management doesn't work. And I don't agree with that because I think that's all or nothing thinking, but that's another topic. But so I was thinking more about, so everyday changes in our lives, we experience change. So, and we're good at change. We deal with change all the time. So in the workplace, there's these micro changes that happen in our roles that we'll deal with, whether it's, even in the office, if it's the change of coffee that's used in the office or change in meeting, or, we're constantly bombarded with changes or changes in times of meeting and changes of direction. So, and how do we address that and how do we identify that? Because I think that's an important element in saying, hey, look, change management does work. We do it all the time, and maybe not change management, but how we cope with change. So there's that type of change. And then there's changes that happen in teams. And I was reading something recently about Agile. And after each sprint, every 2 weeks or so, what the team does is they get together and they talk about what works, what doesn't work. They reflect on what happened, and then they adjust their sails and they create a plan. And that's change, right? And I really like that because that's kind of a change on a project level. And then we have change in kind of this department levels, of, so we're having this issue that has come up, or this is the direction of the overall department. And, in my experience, we do that quarterly. We talk about what changes we're going to make. And so, so that's another type of change. And then there's, the executive level changes of, these are our yearly plans. This is the direction. So when I started to think about the different types of change, I was thinking of, there's adjustments that we make, and that's one type of change. There's also plan changes. I think you mentioned that about, so this is an issue that we have and this is how we're going to address it. And then there's also changes that just emerge. Like I was watching a podcast from Lockheed Martin. And one of the directors there, she was talking about how they're responding to their clients is they have a need that comes from the client. And so they bring in and they completely restructure their environment so that they can meet the changes or the challenges that the customer needs them to meet. And that's another type of, kind of emergent change that also needs a plan. So that's kind of what I'm thinking. And I know that that's not an exhaustive list, but that's where I'm coming from.
No, I'm totally on board with that. Some people will go ahead and address only the big changes, but I agree. There's a range of change. And one of the easy ways to address that is the Anderson and Anderson model, where they talk about developmental, transitional, transformative change. And they make that distinction, and you could add probably a couple other distinctions on top of that. But developmental change is within your control, and the end state. Now, even more basic than that is some of the simple things you're talking about, just minor modifications. But developmental change might be where you're working with an employee, or you're even working on developing yourself, in which case you can clearly identify the end state you desire, and you or a small group can collectively have control over all decisions made within that change process. Okay. Those are easy. Those are developmental change. Well, I should say they're not necessarily easy because you still have to address habits, but you don't have to go for permission and authority outside of those that are involved. Okay, that's developmental change. Transitional change is where you can clearly identify the end state, but you don't have control. You have to involve others that may be impacted stakeholders, those that hold resources, or those that may have authority over the necessary decisions. Okay. Those are transitionals. The key part of it, though, is that you can clearly identify the end state.
Okay.
And those are pretty easy to do, and that's probably the domain of change management. Change management is just basically going through the process. The end state's already identified, and you're just procuring the resources, the approvals. So it's really a project associated for change. Transformational change, this is the much more difficult one because the end state is not clearly identified in advance. This is more of a directional change. And I use in some of my work an example where the company went through a dramatic near-death experience. We put in place a new strategy. That strategy worked really great for 10 years, but then started to stumble. It was starting to be copied by competitors and the industry had changed. But I was being challenged as to what needed to change specifically. And we really didn't know. Okay, all we knew is that something needed to be changed. And it was late at night. I was sitting in my manager's office looking at the sunset over his shoulder. He had a west window. And it occurred to me that everybody in the company knew we needed to go west, but we were unwilling to start that trip until we knew where exactly we were going and the route we were going to take. Okay. 2 years later, we started going west. We still didn't know where we were going, and we didn't know the route we were going to take, but it got so painful, we started going west. That's transformative change, and that you've got to start going. And this is where some of your statistics as to change success is very difficult because it's hard to evaluate a change initiative when you don't know where you're starting at the beginning.
Right. And perhaps it's perspective of how we use change tools, right? So instead of thinking about thinking of it as a strategy, and just strategies always need to be tied to metrics.
Yeah.
You know, that I think that there's some fallacy in that aspect of always having to measure everything, because some things like the soft skills, how can you truly measure if someone's an inspirational leader? You know, that kind of thing. So
this is where some of the narrative processes come in. They evaluate narratives over time. I'm not really a total fan of narrative,
right? Because
they're difficult to do, but if done successfully, you can see how the narratives change, and you can see progress in that. You can also sit back and get a relative feel of, am I further west than I started?
Progress.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Now it's progress in a direction, and you might not know exactly what you want, but you know what you don't want. And if you're moving away from what you don't want, that is somewhat progress too. Those are the key Anderson and Anderson model. But on top of that, you probably would need to add emergent change also. And emergent change is what's happening all the time. It's the little things that we're doing naturally. You run into a traffic jam on your way to work.
Right.
Well, you have a decision. Do you sit there or do you bail out and take an alternate route? Okay.
Right.
We're making these all the time. And you're right. We're good at it. We're good at recognizing patterns. So for example, in the Tulsa area, if I hear on the radio that there's a traffic jam ahead, Do I worry or don't I worry? Well, generally I don't worry, because the delay on the news reporting is such that by the time I get to that point, the traffic jam's off to the side, and there's very little slowdown.
Yeah.
So these are things that you kind of learn from the patterns and you react accordingly.
So what would you call that? Was that, I looked at some resiliency research. I looked at, coping strategies, those kind of things. And I'm not sure if it's even important to identify, but what would you say that, because I know that there's also a spectrum of how people even deal with those types of changes in their lives. And I think that is indicative of how people deal with change in a workplace too.
Yep. You're now starting to get into another adjacent area that is really critical, and that is control over the change.
Right.
And this is a key factor that often is involved in resistance of, are you being changed or allowed to voluntarily choose to change?
Right.
And that makes a big decision, particularly when there's an ongoing flood of changes coming at you. So you get into how change can be controlled. Okay. And traditionally, a change management approach looks at controlling the process. Change leadership looks at the vision and getting people to move toward that vision. Okay. Emergent change is what's naturally happening based upon reactions to the immediate environment. And this is where you can get into nudging. There's a lot of discussion now on nudging. It's how to influence change by putting little modifications into the system and seeing what happens. This goes back to complexity science of a butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil and there's a tornado in Kansas. Okay. It comes from that, in that there's a cause-effect relationship, but you can only identify that in hindsight. You cannot necessarily predict what will happen, but you have a gut feel that if you start nudging the system enough, things will happen. Okay. And this is where you get into co-creation. Co-creation brings people into the process. That itself is a major nudge, in that they are now more in control and can take advantage of their insights and their connection to do things differently, see things differently. So those are all emergent approaches.
What would be an example of a modification, a nudge?
Well, for example, in one of the clients that we're working with now, the main problem is one of customer complaints. Okay, the customer complaints are such that it's not only the customers complaining to the subsidiary, but they're even complaining to the parent company. Okay. The nudge is basically bringing people in from across the organization into a network team.
Okay.
And basically confronting them with the problem from the customer's voice and identifying the need for purpose alignment across the organization. I mean, just the mere act of bringing them together. Peter Block does a lot of writing on community building. Okay, it's the power of convening. Just by bringing people together to talk is a nudge. They will start to see different perspectives because they're now being confronted with those different voices that might have otherwise been locked away in organizational silos. So they see things differently, and by purposely putting them into a network and then tasking them with solving the solution and not giving them the solution, they start to see things differently and act differently. So what you're doing is, in this case, is you're identifying a small piece of the organization and you're putting something into that whole. Okay. you're not forcing a change, but you're seeing what happens. And then based upon what happens, you deal with adjoining issues. So for example, we started teaching them the entrepreneurial mindset, effectuation, different principles of how entrepreneurs think. One of them is you take action with the means you have available to you. Historically, they were always complaining about lack of resources. Once we told them to start taking action with what they already have, they realized they had enough. And collectively, they even had more than enough working together. So, I mean, this was kind of a realization they came to. But again, all you did is you flipped their mindset of asking for resources versus, looking what you have and seeing what you could do with what you have, and then let's talk.
Yeah.
So it's opening up different ways of thinking. Okay. Then associated with this, and also is another basic change process. Okay, if you look at the theories of change, there's 4 basic core change processes. One is a planned process. You identify the gap between where you are and where you want to go. That's a traditional planned change approach. Another one that happens all the time is the natural life cycle. Organizations go through startup, growth, maturity, death, or a rebirth process. I mean, that's just a natural life cycle of all living things, and organizations fall within that pattern. Okay. That's a 2. Another one that's frequently used is the dialectic discourse, point counterpoint. Okay. In which case you confront somebody with 2 opposing points of view and let them sort through the conflict. Okay. And a lot of consulting, a lot of psychoanalytical work is this way. You basically confront people with a situation and let them see it differently, and then force the reflection. You don't necessarily predict a response, but you know that once you get the conflict in place, something will happen. Okay, one side will give, the other side will give, or they come up with a new possibility. Okay, that's a dialectic approach.
And the underlying force is tension.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
Okay.
You purposely build tension where none had been before.
Okay.
And they have to confront that tension. They can allow the tension to exist with a knowledge that there is tension. Or they can realize that you can do something on one side or the other to eliminate that tension, or to add to that force to make the movement so that one side will dominate over the other. But again, it becomes a choice once you realize that the tension is in place.
Quick question: how do you manage that tension to make sure that it doesn't go beyond breaking point, so that it doesn't cause conflict in the organization, which can cause negative effects?
Well, that's just where you stay loosely connected. You see see what happens. You may need to intervene with some ground rules. Okay. Or let's put this aside for now, and let's step back and talk about our basic values.
Right.
Okay. We know where we got a conflict. Now let's step back and see where we have some similarity of beliefs. Yeah. And then that basically cools it down and refocuses them, and then you can go back again. Okay. So again, it's an observation, and again, it's more of like a little nudge of, okay, let's put that aside, and let's go over here and work on something adjacent, and then we can come back to it later. Okay, that makes sense. Then there's also, let me think, the evolutionary. Okay, evolutionary is happening all the time, and this is where the competency model of organizational change comes in. And that you prepare people for possibilities, and those possibilities may not be needed at that particular time, but should conditions change, then they may.
Is this scenario planning?
Scenario planning fits exactly in that. Exactly right. Scenario planning comes up with possibilities that you mentally work through. if it happens, then you've already got the mental model in place to use. Or what often happens is it doesn't come out exactly as a scenario, but it's close. So you have a starting point and you're already mentally prepared to move down that way of thinking. So scenario is that way. The thinking of what's the worst case scenario. What would happen if the worst case scenario happens? Can we survive? Can we react? And that then factors into the choice of do we go down that road or not. If you could face the worst case scenario, then you obviously go that way, because what's the worst that can happen? Well, you're still okay.
Yeah.
And that's another part of the entrepreneurial thinking that falls in there. So you've got all these different ways of helping the organization think a little bit different. You mentioned that 70% failure rate. I actually ran up against this when I was writing my dissertation 20 years ago. The statistic was used, and I used it, and one of my committee members challenged me as to where I got it. Okay. Well, actually, up until that point, I hadn't referenced it because it was just so common. Okay.
Yeah.
So I had to go back, and I was very easily able to identify a number of respected authors' journals that were using that statistic. So it was very easy to go ahead and reference, but at the same time, I found that it really wasn't well researched because of the problems of researching transformative change, especially. Okay. And transformative change is probably where the failure rate most often occurs, because you're trying to do a planned change effort in something that has to emerge.
Okay. And explain that a little bit further.
Okay.
I think what you're saying is, so what I envision is, let's say the CEO says, we need to increase profits, or something is wrong here, and so we need to do this. And so they go about it, they create a change initiative to ultimately increase profit, and the change initiative might have been successful in another way, but it doesn't it doesn't increase profits, so it's deemed as a failure. But I'm sure I'm missing lots of
that could be part of it. But again, that problem is probably one that is complicated that turns complex. Okay. This gets into the Kuhn-Even model of a simple cause effect. A causes B. Okay, that's simple. Very few problems fall within that category.
Right.
A complicated problem is A causes B, which causes C, which causes C. So you see a direct line from A to C. Okay, that's complicated. So when you talk about improving profit, it starts off as a complicated problem because there's cause effect. Okay, are you going to be increasing sales, or are you going to decrease expenses? Okay, what drives sales? The price, the volume, the customers, the product, all things you could focus on. What are all the different pots of expenses? And you could drill down into that. And as you drill down into each component, you can deal with that component as a separate, isolated problem. You solve that problem, and it will flow to solving the bigger problem, at least partially. Okay, that's a complicated. But what likely will happen is at some point you're going to run into people issues.
Yeah. The
communication, the organization, the work processes. This is where it starts to get complicated because now it's no longer a strictly linear, but you got feedback loops. Such that A causes B, causes C, causes D, but also D causes some influence on A. So you got circular, reaction. This is where a culture change happens. So if you say, I want to change the culture, you can identify a desired cultural attribute, but it is extremely difficult to show the cause-effect relationship to get there because there's so many feedback loops, other things that aren't in your model that are going to be discovered along the way. And
so it's kind of like if we think of a neuron that has multiple outputs and inputs, So you can look at one element of culture, but it affects so many different things.
Exactly right. It impacts so many different things, but even more problematic is that as those affect other things, it eventually will come back and influence where you started.
Okay.
So it's not a circle, but it's a spiral effect,
Okay.
in that things keep coming back, but you never really close the loop because time has passed. So you can't completely close the loop, but it gets close, and things, keep spiraling in different directions.
Interesting. So it's almost like whack-a-mole.
Oh yeah, exactly. No,
Yeah.
exactly right. Whack-a-mole is a perfect example of it. You whack down one problem and another one's going to pop up somewhere else. Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so you got all these things interacting. Let me see what you got here. Does that pretty much address your first one? I think so.
It does.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. It also somewhat talks about the scale of change, and also.
It does. And I think because it definitely, there's a spectrum. So, and you were even talking about even those, kind of when we were talking about the whack-a-moles, even those are emergent changes. So if you nudge something one way, then a change will emerge that, is not expected. And that's kind of the micro level. So I think of like the spectrum of change too, and maybe that.
Yeah. But in the whack-a-mole, okay, you can think of whack-a-mole as being complicated or complex. Okay. So for example, if there's a pattern of when the moles pop up, you can get ahead and quickly know that pattern. However, if the pattern changes based upon how hard you hit each mole, that becomes complex then, because you don't know where it's going to come up next, because you can't control your force of hit exactly every single time.
Right. So that's where, do you think this is where the art of it comes into the dealing with the complexity component? And maybe this is another subject altogether.
The art probably comes more in observation.
Okay.
And reacting to that, because it's identifying what the patterns are.
Okay.
And then reacting to the patterns, or experimenting relative to the patterns.
So emergent change, and I'll just say this quickly. Emergent change takes an entirely different skill set, it sounds like, an entirely different way to measure it. And I think that's why, would you agree with that?
It's, you can measure progress, but even then, you have to, it's more of identifying what you have dissatisfaction with, and moving away from the dissatisfaction. You may have in mind a desired cultural attribute you would like to encourage.
Okay.
And you may do certain things to encourage it, in how you convene people in teams, the assignments you give them, the vision you lay out, hoping that will ripple.
Okay.
And continue to move in the desired direction. But those ripples go in all directions, and you may get other things happening, some which you need to be careful of, that you may not want, and you may need to have to suppress some of those ripples. Again, emergent change is happening all the time. And one of the discussions that Reg just started, I think it was yesterday, that I need to jump on board and encourage others, and that is looking at culture. Okay, and he's got some specific questions that he's bringing up relative to culture and how to influence it.
And I drafted a response.
Okay.
And then I deleted it because I realized what I had initially thought was, because when I was looking at one of the things that I was looking at was how emergent acquisition affects culture. And so I was getting into the culture literature, and I was looking into sociology at this time. And this was probably 10, 12 years ago. And at that time, there was some consistency as far as the definition of culture. But then when I went back just in the last couple of days and I started looking at the literature, they're facing the same issues that we're facing in our field as far as what is culture.
Yep.
And I think anytime there isn't a consensus on what it is, then it brings up lots of heated debates, and so I erased that because I wasn't quite sure how to address that. And interestingly, though, I found an article that kind of talked about it, just highlighted some LinkedIn comments of how different people were identifying culture, and they all seem to kind of come back to the idea of it's a huge concept. And it includes all these things like communication, norms, behaviors, so that is interesting. So I think that there's a lot of commonalities out there that maybe there just isn't the language or the conversations around that. Anyway, so yes, I'd like to jump in on that.
Yeah, Reg sent me a 2010 article that actually addressed different ways of how culture was viewed.
Oh, cool.
And, it started off with your traditional point of view of quote, culture is the way we do things around here.
Right. Yep. Okay. Yeah.
But then it was going into how complexity thinking was looking at more of an emergent view of culture.
Yeah.
In which case, how we do things might be a snapshot in time, but it doesn't say how that is evolving, because after that snapshot in time, it's no longer the same. It's moved on. Things are always changing.
Right. And that's so true. And I even thought of, when, I'm very visual, so I'm constantly thinking of how to think of things, but like a drop of water in a bucket, you talked about the ripples. So the culture is the same way. If there's some idea that gets dropped in the bottle of, of the organization, of the people that are in it. And then that starts and people start to communicate these ideas, then that can start to shift the culture. And then it can be, emergent. So the culture is always shifting, changing, reflecting itself. So yeah, it's very complex. Yeah.
Okay. Let me see what else I got here.
Yeah.
Okay. On D, you talk about ownership of change.
Well, and really,
this gets into some interesting organization politics in some ways of who leads the change process. And a while back, I wrote an article as to the Office of Change Management. Okay, and actually who controls it. And there's like, 8 to 10 different points of control that could be, because it's interdisciplinary across the organization.
Right.
And many organizations will have one part of the organization traditionally take the lead. Or it may convene an ad hoc cross-organization team, but even then lean it one direction depending upon who's put in charge of the team and who's basically setting the pace of it. So it gets into multiple ways of doing it, but also multiple people involved and how those power may play out. So it gets into a number of issues. When you talk about ownership also, you might say who's the champion of it, who charters it. One thing you can say about the 70% failure rate, actually, there's two things you can say. One is that statistic's been used frequently now for 20 years that I've, since my dissertation, it was in common use back then. So it's probably 30 to 40 years minimum of people accepting it. And there has to be some validity to it, or people would not be accepting it and repeating it.
Right.
If they didn't believe it, they wouldn't, be repeating it. So to some extent, they believe it and are repeating it. So there's some validity there. Also, McKinsey does an annual survey of CEOs. And one question they usually ask is a satisfaction of the change within their organization. And the results comes right around 30%, plus or minus maybe 4% of the CEOs who are satisfied. Now, again, that's probably talking about large scale transformational change.
Mm-hmm.
And it's from a particular point of view, theirs. But again, they're the ones that are chartering the change,
right,
and funding the change. So there's some validity in using that as a valid statistic. Okay. So, I mean, there's some validity to the 70% based on those two factors.
Okay. So, and back to power and politics, I think that's a really important piece. That it almost seems like that's something that a CEO could address head on. When I was in an organization, I noticed that the two that conflicted the most over who owned the change were at the executive level. One was head of HR, the other was head of operations. And those two were going head to head. Now, when I got into the work of it and I started working with lower level managers, there was some of that, but it was more, okay, let's just get into the work and how can we help each other and let's work together. So it almost seems like, okay, well, if this is, if we're talking about a planned top-down change, which, we've been talking a lot about emergent change, but I think there will always be a need for these types of change, especially as CEOs set their agendas. But isn't that something that CEOs can manage? If they're unhappy about it, they can look at their executives team and say, hey, we're on the same team here. Let's just get down to the nuts and bolts of this. Or is that tension important? I don't know. But if it's such a high failure rate, it seems like, okay, how do we address the power in politics?
We like to think that position of power has the control to do that. Mm-hmm. But invariably, personal power can trump it. Okay. If you take a look at successful leaders, mm-hmm. oftentimes it wasn't their positional power as much as it was their personal power to get things done.
Their influence.
Yeah, their influence, their ability, their respect. Any number of factors that come into the arena of personal powers. Mm-hmm. A classic case is I was in an organization that brought in, it was probably close to 1,000 people to a large meeting in Las Vegas. And the president and CEO got up on stage and laid out in elaborate detail a plan mm-hmm. of how they were going to do a restructuring, all the benefits, how things were going to get done. And everyone was wildly enthusiastic. Mm-hmm. We left the meeting and nothing was done. Not a single thing was done. And what ended up happening was this was being done from corporate headquarters, but the regional vice presidents in a decentralized company had enormous power.
Okay.
And this was moving some of that power from their regional office into corporate headquarters.
Okay.
And they nodded in agreement. They were on stage. They nodded in agreement mm-hmm. in Las Vegas. But then when they went back to their home office, they did nothing. It was a total passive aggressive behavior. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And because it was dependent upon them giving up some of their power, and they failed to do so, and there was no force from the top because the entire performance system really gave the power to the vice presidents, and nothing was changed in the performance management system to really hinder them in their passive aggressive behavior. So there was absolutely no, it was an amazing case study of passive aggressive behavior.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that happens all the time. So, well, and that's what I think part of looking at change initiatives is, really understanding who's has the real power. And I think
Yep.
you and Reg have talked about that. That's kind of the hidden networks and the hidden, and I often think of subcultures
Yep.
that form, and that's really tricky. That's tricky to understand without really getting into being
Yep.
able to observe how things are done.
Yep. They have to be discovered.
Mhm.
And this is where an internal consultant has an advantage over an external consultant.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
An external consultant comes in, they think they know the solution. They've got no idea what the problem is.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. You made a comment in D of networks versus systems.
Mhm.
I don't know if I understand that because I see them as being so similar that I almost use them interchangeably.
Okay. Okay.
Networks are often thought about of nodes and linkages, but systems are really, if you map systems, you map them the same way.
Okay. That's what I
Now,
let
you
me
could
bring up.
you could probably map a process as a system, but oftentimes that process also could be mapped as a network because it would connect people and communication information. So I don't know if I make that distinctions per se. Historically, though, you've got systems analysis
Mhm.
and all kinds of dynamics and archetypes, and
Mhm.
study the archetypes and how the systems interact. Whereas in a network analysis is normally focused on the people,
Mhm.
who's connected to who, the strength of the connections, the directionality of the connections.
That's I think what I was. That's what I was thinking about, and particularly I was thinking about. Okay, so we have these networks of people, and then we have like the technology systems.
Yeah.
So I was wondering when it came to, let me.
Yeah. See what Reg and I use, we use a network of networks.
Okay, and I guess I'm still trying to understand how the networks work in the Humocracy.
Okay. In a network of networks, you've got a formal organization chart, which
Mhm.
is a large hub and spoke network.
Okay.
Okay. Behind that, though, is the informal network of what people are doing to basically do the workarounds to get the work done. So instead of
Okay.
communicating everything up the organization to cross and down the organization, they find their own personal linkages and they make it work.
Okay.
Or the ad hoc cross-organization teams, that's all in the background. So you have a combination of a formal network and informal network. And in many of the new organizations, they're doing a little bit of a hybrid. They are purposely making connections and crafting those connections, nurturing them versus letting them happen just emergent. It's kind of like the power of convening. You make connections. That is the people network. But then associated with that is a work process network that might be embedded in there. That would be the value chain, the support, and that can sometimes get rather messy too, particularly if it's a service organization. But then on top of that, okay, that would be one network. Okay, but on top of that would be an information network where information is generated, where it is stored, how it is communicated, and who uses it. Okay, so that is a network itself, but it's got touch points in the people network. A third level of networks might be your communities of practice. They might be formal communities of practice or informal, where people have a common skill and know each other. And that then starts to bleed into a fourth level of networks, which is your friendship network. People that you may know from previous work assignments on cross-organization teams, or even might be neighbors that live close to you that you now know you work together with you. Okay, so each one of those is a separate network and can be mapped separately, but there's also interconnections between each of the networks and the other networks. So it becomes complex very rapidly.
And so is technology kind of overlaid over all of this, because technology can be used for different things?
Technology is an enabler of the networks.
Mm-hmm.
It is core to the information network.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's also a central part of the work process networks.
Mm-hmm.
And in many cases now, the interactions of those information networks and the work process networks.
Right. The communication aspect, right?
The communication aspects, as well as what is communicated. And to some extent, it's also an enabler of communities of practice.
Okay.
People in remote locations can now connect where before they might not have been able to, even known of others' existence.
Right. Right. Well, it almost seems like we need a fourth dimensional model. What do you think about that? I haven't seen one. It'd be complex, but I'm trying to think of the model that can represent the complexity of all these layers.
Well, what Reg and I use is we use a node and line network that shows customers, value chain, and suppliers. And then we add on to that some adjacent options on the value chain.
Okay.
I mean, we like to think of the value chain as a single line, but a lot of times there's options of how the value chain may be split and come back together.
Okay.
And then associated with that are all the staff functions and how they have touch points across it. So you've got a basic value chain network, and on top of that, then all the direct connections. That becomes a network of work teams. But then to represent the information network, the community practice network, the friendship network, instead of trying to show all those connections, because at that point it gets really messy, what we do is we just capture that as 3 separate clouds. So you got your basic network that is truly network, and people would recognize it as a network. But then above that, we've got what would be 3 other types of networks, but they're kind of in the cloud, that we know that they're connected down, but we don't try to show those connections because it would just get so messy. You'd have to track individual parts of it and ignore the totality.
That makes sense. Okay.
Okay, you saw the article that Reg had done on the future of HR.
I did.
Yeah.
I did. And it really triggered my mind. And one of the questions that I think I'm wondering, I'm sure it's been discussed before, is does change need to come out of HR? Does change really need to be on the executive level, or is it make sense to have change in HR because that's where the people are? I think what concerns me is that we haven't really gotten HR to the executive table yet. And we've been trying.
Yeah. We've been trying that for 20 years.
Exactly. And it hasn't been working.
Yeah.
So
in fact, I was on a team with the American Productivity and Quality Center that was studying, at that time it was called Next Generation HR, which was really strategic HR. And we did benchmarking and this goes back to, the late 90s.
Yeah.
Okay. But when you take a look at the LinkedIn or the Facebook groups in HR, there's nothing ever discussed on strategy. Everything is the nuts and bolts of hiring, firing,
right,
performance or policy enforcement, things like that.
Right.
The question of who controls change then, the companies I worked with in the past, generally it was HR or corporate communication, because corporate communication also did the internal communication.
Right.
And the operations was kind of an add-on to it. But to some extent, that was the large cultural changes. The operational type changes, the operations would lead themselves and would generally not involve the other staff organizations. They would just get on with it and do it. You get into the Helix organization that McKinsey is now pushing. Instead of doing a matrix that is product and functional or product functional geographic, I mean, you could cut the matrix multiple dimensions there. Instead of doing a matrix organization that way, the Helix comes at it as a value chain production on one side of producing work, and the other being the people management side.
Okay.
Managing the deployment of people, the hiring, firing, the training of people. But again, that gets somewhat messy because there's still a negotiated process. And if you talk about that negotiation, the HR side doesn't have a lot of power in many cases when they're working up against the people side. And those cases where they've been developed revert back to a matrix organization or a standard traditional hierarchy really rapidly, because there's nothing that really is the core to the people side when you just separate that out arbitrarily. You get into a lot of challenges then of who's involved, who takes the lead,
Right.
Even who's on the change team itself.
Well, and I think that this is, that adds a lot of, to me, looking from the outside, and I know every change is different and every organization is different, but it seems like when you have so much ambiguity, you have so much infighting over who owns this, it distracts from the ability to actually focus on the work, actually, inspire people to make these changes. And what I'm seeing is people in operations are actually, especially through project management, are kind of taking this on themselves. So I'm going to learn change management. I'm going to bring this on so that, we don't need, they aren't saying this, but that's kind of what I'm hearing is we don't really need change management experts in HR.
You have a couple of things. One is the general frustration with HR.
Yeah.
Because HR rarely understands operations.
Right.
So for example, I was at one point in my career, I was manager of HR planning. Okay. HR department probably had 50 people in a matrix organization, 50 people, probably 30 of those at corporate headquarters, the other 20 at remote sites with dotted lines to corporate headquarters. Out of every one of the 50, I was the only one that had non-HR experience.
Yeah.
And that's normal.
Right. It is normal. And it even in, I will say in my own experience through HRD, we didn't learn about value chains. And we didn't learn, right? And even when I went in to take business courses, the business school was like, oh, you don't belong here. I was like, why not? I do belong here. So, I think that's kind of, there's this volleying too of you're in HR, you need to stay here, kind of mentality. And if anything, I think, let's expand it. Why don't we have change agents in every division? Why don't we have people integrated into operations that, have these expertise? But
I did a course for PMI, Project Management Institute, about 2 years ago on change resistance.
Okay.
And they just eat it up. They love it. It's still watched regularly, and I get comments regularly thanking me for the course. But again, it's basic information, but they were trained in the process of managing a project. And they only think about the people side when they run into resistance.
Right.
Okay.
I've noticed that.
And the challenge of operations, okay, operations need to change. They're what I call the inadvertent change managers.
Ah, okay.
Inadvertent change managers, they don't want to be change managers, but they're forced into that role to be successful, to meet their performance goals. Okay.
Makes sense.
So they're forced into the role. They know nothing about it. They have no training whatsoever in it. They only know what they've observed in the past. And if they're working only on observational learning, that kind of leads right into your 70% failure rate. Because if you're learning from failure, you may know what you don't want to do, but that doesn't necessarily mean you know what to do. Okay, and they keep continuing. And again, it's a, on the levels of involvement. Okay, an inadvertent change manager would like to use level 1. They would like to tell people what to do, and oftentimes they do. When they realize that doesn't work, they go to selling, and most change efforts are level 2 selling. Levels 3 and 4 are testing and consulting, which would give you better results because people are more involved, but you're still leaving out level 5, which is co-creation. They don't even think about that. And what Reg and I are trying to do in our work is we're trying to figure out, how do you bring together project teams to co-create the solution without giving them the solution? And that's what we're doing with purpose alignment. The purpose alignment defines the problem, but then convenes a team to solve it and steps back.
Yeah.
To the extent that they need additional connections, then they do the network weaving for that, but they step back and get out of the way.
Well, and what about having them identify the problems as well?
Yes, but yeah, exactly. Well, you identify the problem probably at a symptom level, and then you turn it over to the team to find out what the core problem is. Yeah,
and give them the tools to be able to do that.
That's right.
That's what I think. I think that, yeah.
It's a different way, and middle managers have some difficulty with that because they're problem solvers themselves. This is asking them to go to a higher level of identifying the symptoms and putting some parameters around that, and then figuring out who needs to be involved with working on it, and then turn it over to them and give them the resources, but don't give them the solutions because you don't have enough knowledge to know the solution. That's a different skill set that we're working on how to develop that skill set.
I think that's wonderful. And I almost see that as, you mentioned that with one of your earlier examples of how to address emergent change. And I think almost, I could envision, having these change management strategically placed experts throughout the organization. And then when a change is necessary or when an emergent change comes up, is facilitating bringing the right people together who I think, why aren't we involving frontline employees more, like what you were saying, in these projects, and then having them really help to drive the change, and enabling them, giving them skills to, do these things.
Yeah. And the change experts have to be there for the big problems. There's not enough of them as was really needed. Yeah. Okay. So what Reg and I are trying to work on is what principles can we put in place that enable things to happen more from an emergent point of view without having to have the experts there all the time telling them what to do. Yeah. Well, how do you teach someone to do that rather than tell them? Yeah. But build into the system versus build it into a internal consultant or training position. Yeah. Well, wouldn't that be aligned with the mission, the vision, processes? That's part of it, but then also the competencies. The competencies, yeah. Yeah. What are the set of competencies needed to execute that type of role? Okay. You go through then on your last item, a laundry list of different disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true. I mean, it crosses really so many, and that's one of the challenges then of teaching organizational change within a business curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, most undergraduate programs have one OD course in the HR curriculum. They've got one change management course in the management and leadership curriculum. Both of those courses are electives within each major, and both require organization behavior as a prerequisite, which sometimes is a required major area, but not in all curriculums is even required. So what you then have is a core organization change course, in all cases an elective, and in some cases has a prerequisite that itself may be a prerequisite.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at the students, probably only a quarter of the HR students will take the OD course.
Mm-hmm.
Only a quarter of the management and leadership majors will take the change management course. And when you take a look at both courses, they need to be integrated together because they each have different content that need to be used in the other.
Mm-hmm.
I had an interesting conversation when I first left corporate America, went into academia.
Mm-hmm.
The professor in the office next to me was a professor of HR.
Okay.
We had an interesting discussion in the hall one day that kind of caught me by surprise. She was teaching the OD course in the HR curriculum, and I was teaching the change management course in the business on the management side. And she made the comment that she saw change management as a subdivision of organization development. And I thought it was kind of interesting because I saw organization development as a set of tools used within change management.
Interesting. See, yes, I would have to say I've always viewed organizational development as this umbrella, and then you have different concepts, including change management, and then other,
Yeah, but see, you come from the HR side.
I do.
See, I don't come from the HR side.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it's totally a different point of view, and the emphasis is different. For example, when I came from change management, my doctorate is in organizational change and leadership.
Okay.
Combined. And when you study leadership, you have to study change.
Yeah.
Okay, but you don't have to study OD.
Okay. See, why not? See, and that was because my degree is organizational learning, organizational development, organizational change, organizational performance. Okay, but I almost think that under the umbrella of organizational development is learning, is leadership. Yep. So it's just a way to organize things,
They are superficially.
Yeah.
But not in the depth that is needed across business.
That makes sense. Yeah.
But at the same time, though, I quickly changed the course focus from change management to organizational change.
Yeah, which makes sense because change management almost seems like a set of tools.
Because change management is a set of process tools, and you're leaving out change vision, which is the leadership side of it. So what I do is I teach it from a three-legged stool. Okay, organizational change is change management, which is the process, change leadership, which is the vision, and change enablement, which is the OD.
Change enablement is, now explain that. How is it OD?
Okay, it's basically working on the people side of change.
Okay. So is that because part of development, as I think of it, is that organizational leadership, developing leaders through various, and learning can be, through training, traditional, or it can be through informal learning. learning from others. So
Right.
is that how you view it as well? Or
Yeah,
is it a little
I deal with learning from the macro perspective.
okay.
Some of my doctorate work was on adult learning theory.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I came out of the educational department. So that,
Yeah.
and I took many classes in education. So it's interesting though. But do you think of learning as enablement? Or how do you think of enablement?
I think of enablement very, very broadly.
Okay.
You've got the set of tools, which are the management, the project side.
Right.
You've got the vision that is ahead.
Right.
Okay. Enablement is everything else then of how to combine those two together and actually make it happen.
Okay.
It's all the things you have to do with the people, which gets back into the complexity. There's no neat pattern.
Yep, that makes sense.
So I don't try to deal with enablement as a set of tools as much as it is a direction and a whole collection of things that have to be done.
Interesting. Well, and I think, and the reason why I bring this up, and and I didn't even include sociology or anthropology in organizational change too, but they have theories of how people connect and interact and all those things. So I think they're an important element too, is how do we bridge all this? And a lot of it comes down to communication, right? Is what do you mean when you refer to this?
Yep.
And so how do we start to bridge that so that the community can come together of people who are inspired by change and really have meaningful conversations? And I think that's what you and Reg are trying to do with these discussion groups.
Yeah, one of the papers I did for my doctorate was basically anthropology based.
Oh, cool. Okay.
I went into the archives on the intranet for a change project and looked at all the artifacts and saw what we could learn from all the artifacts on the change process.
Oh, cool. Okay. Very
So
cool.
it was like a archaeological dig.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's so well. And what I think that brings is really the depth of how we can approach this. I had a professor who, what he loved to do was he was methodology focused, but what he would do is he would go into schools and take photographs, or actually take photographs of artifacts, which were, things that were on the walls, everything to look at. Okay, so what do kids see every day that impacts how they think of themselves, how they think of the school? And he found, that he found themes within that. And so I think that's one thing that we can do with organizations too. It's different now that everybody's remote, but so all these different ideas, that I think adds depth to how we approach change management. But I think that's
okay. We're past our hour today.
okay.
Anything else that is top of mind for you?
How can I help you guys with the work group?
Okay.
What are you looking for?
I've got a start of a post out there now of looking for ideas from you.
Okay.
And I will shortly start a series of polls to determine levels of interest.
Okay.
Let me see.
So what is your, I know you guys, I suspect you guys are probably using your philosophies of nudging with this group to see, what changes you want, but what are your overall goals with this work group? What would you like to see come from it so that I can know kind of how I can help with the skills that I have?
Okay, give me a second to pull something up here.
Okay. Thank you for your time today.
Okay, let me see if I get my list here. Okay. Right now, we have developed a set of principles and functional levels that would work on implementing those. We have a client case underway right now of moving the basic principles into operation.
Okay.
The core focus there is to see where the points of friction are, and a particular point on what are the needed competencies for different roles.
Okay.
Okay, so for example, in a networked organization with distributed decision making, that requires a slightly different set of roles as to making decisions at the grassroots. Okay.
Right.
It also requires some understanding of decision rights and the types of decisions, and a general guidelines as to how do you decide the decisions relative within some templates, or to figure out the gray areas between the templates. Okay, we're working on those right now. We're also working on how to do purpose alignment network weaving with an objective of creating some developmental courses that we can start to use at scale.
Okay.
Okay. Are you familiar with academia.edu as a website?
I am.
Okay. Traditionally, they have been a repository for academic papers.
Mm-hmm.
They're now moving into a premium model. As part of that premium model, they're developing courses. Okay. And I've got one course that I'm in the process of uploading right now into their collection that deals with Futocracy. Okay, so we're starting to use this then to get the word out. And part of it then is the development of what competencies are needed and how to train for those, because we have to somehow hit its scale.
Right.
What Reg and I are doing, we can do in small cases, but we can't scale. So we're looking to figure out how to scale it with training courses. We're also looking at how to involve other consultants, such that when they're working with their clients, they can take our ideas and see how they fit within their client organizations. Okay, and that's part of it. Part of that then also goes to furthering the learning curve. How to bring more people up the learning curve as to a new vision of how to operate as an organization, and how to bridge. Most of the successful companies that are using non-traditional organization structures are very small, or went through a near-death crisis and had a visionary leader come in at that time, or were a startup that started with the principles and went from there. There's very few cases of a solid major transformation. So what we're working on now is actually a solid major transformation. Okay. And we're basically using a complexity approach of how to work on small little pieces, nudge those pieces, but also don't lose sight of the bigger picture. Okay.
Right.
And that is our form of operation, and so far it's working rather well. We'd like to get other people involved with that, with their clients. I'm not sure exactly how to relate that without bringing them fully on board with the thinking and the thought process.
What do you mean by that?
Well, okay, so for example.
Okay. So first there needs to be a foundation.
So for example, the basic foundation is 5 principles with 5 sub-principles of effectuation, which is the entrepreneur mindset. So you've got 5 core principles, 5 sub-principles. That is core. Okay. Associated with that then would be local principles of operations. So the whole idea is that when you work on something, okay, right now that is really a top-down authority decision-making.
Mhm.
How can you replace that decision-making process with a principle
Mhm.
that will guide action? So what we're
Yeah.
talking about then is the principles, but the principles aren't isolation. The principles also fit together.
Mhm.
Okay, so we got the principle side, and then you've got a rethought process of what the organization structure looks like.
Right.
Instead
It's all
of
for
a
change.
multi-tiered authority delegation, it's a functional level.
Mhm.
Okay, and the functional level comes right back from a higher level thinking of leadership.
Okay.
There's
Okay.
many leadership models that are out there. There's many different ways of studying leadership,
Right.
but recently we run into some problems with those classifications. So, for example, where does participatory leadership fit?
Right.
Okay, where does shared leadership fit? Where
Right.
does where does rotating leadership fit? Okay,
Right.
they don't fit anywhere else.
No,
Okay,
they don't. Yeah.
so the Center's Leadership Development, they and a couple of professors came up with a higher level umbrella for leadership called DAC, DAC,
Okay.
direction, alignment, commitment. And all leadership models fall under there. So for example, a charismatic leader has to set direction,
Mm-hmm.
he has to get alignment, and he has to get commitment. A servant leader has to do the same, but
Right.
setting direction. The setting
Yeah.
direction may be a little different from a servant director's point of view, but he still has to do it.
Right.
Okay, so, and the shared, rotating, precipitating leadership models all fit there too. But once you think about leadership as DAC, it's no longer person dependent.
It's competency. They
It,
turn into
it,
competencies.
it could be competencies, it
Mhm.
could be processes, it could be communication, it could be artifacts. So
Ah,
for example, when you
that's
think
cool.
about setting direction, it's not just the person who sets direction, but it's how the direction is communicated, how the direction is documented.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
so it's you now start to think about leadership and not leaders.
Ah, so it kind of sets it free.
That's right. Now, when you think about that, then is how do you set direction in an organization?
Mm-hmm.
How do you get alignment in an organization? And how do you get commitment? And those are the three functional levels of the organization, and that you've got people doing each of those individually without necessarily doing them collectively. So it's a different way of thinking about running an organization.
Completely different way.
Completely different, but it fits together though. Once you make the transition of there's a difference between leaders and leadership.
Yeah.
Okay.
I like,
So
well, thank you. One quick question is, so you're talking about bringing together consultants. So have you and Rev thought about putting together a certification program?
we have, but we're not to that point yet.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay. It's that we're still.
I know this is being recorded, so I was a little bit like, not sure if I should say it, but.
Yeah, we're thinking about it, but we're still working around the edges.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And we don't have enough of it locked in.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's something we'd also do by ourselves.
Yeah.
And this is where we need to get you and others more involved going forward as to building the core group.
Yeah, I think that's exciting.
Part of this is not only bringing others up to speed, but then having others start to build on what we're doing too.
Okay, that sounds great.
Particularly around the edges. I mean, there's going to be a lot of need for competency building courses.
Okay.
And I said, we continue to learn what's working, what's not working, and continue to modify our thinking. So right now, part of the focus is on clarifying decision rights.
Okay.
We're focused on the competencies required for different roles.
Okay.
We're focused on, to some extent, culture. That's one that we've come to a couple times, but we focus more on culture from a behavioral standpoint versus just a general culture.
Well, I love that topic. I love thinking
Yeah.
about culture and how people interact and the experience of employees. So I'll jump in on the discussion with Reg. So that actually answered my question, my last question about how I can help.
Yeah.
So in competencies, I've been a little bit reluctant to start the discussions just because I think some of it is, well, what do I have to offer other consultants? And so, but then it's like, well, I have, quite a bit of education. So, and, and I'm also very good at connecting dots, and I love to talk to people.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And again, we don't expect anyone to have all the answers.
Okay, good.
Okay, what we want is people to come and evaluate and ask the deep questions that we need to be asking.
Yeah, I can do that.
Reg and I have spent close to 4 years now challenging each other with questions. And even now, we'll catch each other every once in a while, reverting back to old ways of thinking.
Okay.
Because it's so embedded, and it says, well, are you really thinking about this from an effectuation standpoint? It says, no, and we have to step back and rethink.
That's wonderful. I think that's great.
So we want people to bring in their thinking, their addition, but also do it from 2 points of view. One is from your paradigm. Mm-hmm. What doesn't fit and why doesn't it fit? Okay.
Right. And I ran up against that in the very beginning with the project management of Agile and all these. And I had to ask myself, why is this bothering me so much?
Yeah.
So I had to challenge my thinking of what doesn't this fit into my paradigm? And then once I did that, I could start to expand. Well, actually, this is a great function for dealing with what we were talking about, emergent change, how they deal with it on a micro level, so I think, is that kind of what you were talking about?
That's it. But what we want to learn from you also is where are those friction points in the paradigm?
Yeah.
Because that gives us learning as to how we need to better explain it or relate it to others. Okay. Because, and that's part of what we're doing with this client right now. And, it's going really well. The president of the subsidiary is totally on board.
That's great.
But at the same time, there are friction points.
Sure. So there are going to be.
So we're using it to figure out, okay, where are the friction points? How can we address those through a learning or a redirection process?
Well, and one of the biggest ones that I see is because we're going towards matrix-driven organizations, is how do we measure that this is successful? How do CEOs go to the board of directors to sell it and to say, okay, this is worth our investment because, is how do they back that up? And that's what I think is, the more that we start to come up with how to reframe measuring these things and how to reframe measuring, the success and how to define the success so we can put in board of directors and CEOs. I mean, do you see that?
That will be needed. Right now, we've talked about the need for assessment evaluation, but we haven't really come down on the details yet. Okay. This is where you and others can provide some insight also.
Okay.
So far, the success has been anecdotal.
Yeah. Yep. And I actually have a good friend that is a professor. He's working in a business school and he teaches these metrics. So he would be a great one to bring into the conversation, actually.
Yeah. So, and again, this is changing to a totally new state. We've got a rough idea of the components of that state. Yeah. But it's not going to be an exact fit for every company either.
No, it's not.
But again, there's the pieces are there, is how to modify those pieces, and that's part of what we're working on right now then too. And this is where, when we get other clients involved, whether ourselves or through you and others, that's where we can then gain additional understanding of, what's still has to be core, what's around the peripheral for modification, how to do those modifications.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, it almost is like, okay, let's take the company where it is, right? It doesn't have to be a complete transformation all at once. In fact, I think that's a better option, is what are some of the things that we can start to adjust now?
Yeah.
And see the
And again,
effect of that.
It's too big to be a complete modification.
Yeah.
You need to focus on little bits and pieces. So we're starting with this client as a customer focus, but instead of doing traditional customer relations management, we're focusing on purpose alignment and building a cross-organization network.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, and both those are being done kind of in the shadow organization, knowing that it is impacting the primary organization, with some plans probably next year to start some reorganizing and collapsing some of the formal organization chart and formalize more of what we're doing informally now.
How exciting.
Yeah.
Exciting work.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Okay. Anything else for today?
No, this is great.
Okay. Look forward to connecting more then on the network, particularly as we get more involved in the working group.
Yeah, sounds great. Okay.
Right.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.